Well, breaking news now with global implications. Nuclear-capable North Korea has just tested another missile. Details now. We're going to talk to Paula Hancock shortly, who is going to join us from Seoul, South Korea. And on the phone is Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr. Barbara, what are you hearing out of the Pentagon?
Well, Anderson, at this hour, U.S. officials in the intelligence community and the military are looking at all the incoming intelligence, trying to figure out exactly what North Korea has launched. As you say, the news agencies across Asia say it was a three-stage long-range rocket. That's the kind of rocket that has the U.S. most worried because it could have intercontinental range, potentially someday hitting Alaska. But right now, the question is exactly what did they launch? How far did it fly? What kind of capability it had? Because, you know, they had that failed test back in April. If they were actually able to do a more successful test this time, so quickly after the failed one, how did they get better? Who helped them? That's the question tonight, Anderson.
Let's check in with Paula Hancock, who's joining us from Seoul, South Korea. Do we know if this launch was successful, Paula?
Well, Anderson, that's what everyone's trying to figure out at this point. So we know the military is watching this very closely and they're tracking the orbit at this point to try and figure out whether or not this was a success. We don't have word yet whether this was a success. We know there's a National Security Committee meeting going on at the moment. The President, the Defence Minister, Foreign Minister are all sat in a room trying to figure out that same question, whether or not it was a success. But I think this would have taken the President and many of the officials by surprise, considering just 2 days ago North Korea said it was having technical issues. So I don't think anybody within South Korea really expected this launch to happen so soon, especially when you consider they actually extended their launch window. They said the launch window would go until the 29th of December, just to give themselves a bit more time. And then suddenly they launched it this morning. So I think this would have taken many officials by surprise. Anderson?
When it's launched, where is it, pointed toward? Is it supposed to just go out to sea?
Well, it's basically launched from the west coast of the country, the Sohae launch station, and the trajectory, if it is a success and if it stays on that flight path it's supposed to, would be over open water. It wouldn't be actually travelling over any territory at all. And North Korea was quite specific about this back on December the 1st when they announced they were going to carry out this rocket launch. They insisted that they had a flight path that was safe. They insisted it wasn't going to affect any neighbouring countries. Of course, you have the likes of Japan setting up Patriot missiles to shoot down any remnants or any debris if they thought it was going to hit part of their territory. So they wanted to make sure that the international community knew that that was the case. Obviously, that's not just what the international community is focusing on. And I think another interesting point to make, I spoke to a senior government official just a couple of days ago, and he said that this is obviously a slap in the face for China as well if they go ahead with this launch, because China just a day before they'd announced this possible rocket launch had been to see them. There had been a Politburo member going to Pyongyang trying to convince them not to carry out this rocket launch, and yet they've gone ahead with it anyway. So certainly we can probably see relations souring a little there.
And Paula, when they've had launches that have failed in the past, do they admit the failure?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Anderson. They actually did admit back in April that the launch was a failure, and that was the first time ever that we had heard those words from Pyongyang, the fact that something had failed. In the past, back in 2006, 2009, they had claimed domestically that it was a grand success and that they'd managed to put a satellite up into orbit. Now, of course, internationally, we knew that wasn't the case and we knew that they were failures, but internally, they always want to say that things are a success. That changed in April, probably because they had the international media camped out in Pyongyang at the time as well, so they couldn't necessarily lie about it. But another interesting point is just 2 days ago, we saw some rare honesty from Pyongyang admitting that they had technical difficulties with this rocket launch as well, and there were issues that they had to work through. So we are seeing a little bit more transparency, if you like, from this incredibly isolated regime. But obviously, the bottom line is the international community didn't want them to go ahead with this rocket launch, and they disregarded that and went ahead with it anyway. Anderson?
And Barbara Starr of the Pentagon. Barbara, how quickly does the Pentagon figure out whether or not this launch has been successful? Do they already know?
They will know very quickly. There are a number of classified systems, satellites, aircraft that can gather signals intelligence out of the air, literally. Several days ago, the U.S. Navy put a number of ships in the region that have very powerful radars and surveillance systems. So all of that is gathering up all the data. They will look at it, and they are very experienced. They will be able to determine pretty closely what kind of missile, where it flew, where it fell, how long it flew. And again, it goes back to what Paula was saying. If this launch really was a three-stage rocket and it really was successful, any more successful than the failed one back in April, the big question for the intelligence community right now is how did the North Koreans do it? And like we said, is somebody out there helping them, perhaps the Iranians? That becomes a much more complex foreign policy and national security issue for the administration, Anderson.
Yeah. Later on this week on this program, I'm going to rebroadcast a report I did originally for 60 Minutes about a concentration camp inside North Korea. We often focus on these rocket launches, not so much on the humanitarian rights issues that are going on inside North Korea. An extraordinary story of a young man who spent the first 23 years of his life in a concentration camp in North Korea, actually born into this concentration camp. The only person known actually to have been born there and actually escaped. He tells his remarkable story. We'll have that report later on this week on 360. Paula Hancock, thank you. Barbara Starr as well. More breaking news ahead. We'll have the latest on the Clackamas Town Center mall shooting in Oregon. 3 people, including the shooter, now confirmed dead.